Welcome to Tech Brothers. In this video, we're going to learn how to install SQL Server in active passive cluster mode. In this demo, we'll be learning installation of SQL Server in cluster mode, and I'll be giving you a quick overview of the cluster that we have stood up for this installation. Number 2, SQL Server cluster mode installation requirements. Number 3, SQL Server cluster service account permission requirement. Number 4, SQL Server cluster shared disk overview and best practices. Keep in mind, I have written a little note right here that if you wanted to understand active and active passive cluster configuration, please watch my video active and active passive cluster configuration overview, and it has a greater detail of understanding both configuration active and active passive. So let's go ahead and take a quick overview of the cluster that we stood up for this installation. Right here, if you notice at the bottom of the screen, I have two nodes. One is TBS node 1 and TBS node 2. This is my 2-node cluster for this demo. We can use either of the node and connect to our cluster manager and look at the configuration of our current cluster. So I'm gonna go ahead and use TBS node 1. So let's go ahead and fire up our failover cluster manager. Right here is our failover cluster manager. Alright, right here is TBS 2012 is my cluster name. If you expand that, roles right here, right now I have just one role configured, which is DTC, Distributed Transaction Coordinator. This is configured. Let's go ahead and take a look on the nodes. We have two nodes in this cluster, TBS node 1 and TBS node 2. Both are up and running. Let's take a look on storage. If you're installing SQL Server Availability Group, you don't need shared disk right here, but in this demo we are installing SQL Server in cluster mode, which requires shared disks. So we have 5 shared disks right here. One right here, one is DTC and other is for Quorum. Up here we have 3 disks. One is for SQL Server data, other is for SQL Server log, and third right here is for temp DB. Keep in mind that this is also following the best practice. You shouldn't put data and log on same disk as far as SQL Server production best practices goes, and also it is a best practice to put temp DB basically on a separate disk. So we're going to follow that as well. If you take a look on networks right here, we have 2 networks. One is cluster and client. This network, also known as external network, this gets used in the communication between your cluster nodes and also your organizational network. So this has communication with the client, as it says cluster and client, and this network up here, also known as heartbeat, and it says cluster only, and this gets used in the communication between these 2 nodes right here. And that's why it says cluster only. It is also known as private network as far as clustering terms go. So what we're going to do is one more thing that is required for SQL Server in order for our SQL Server to install in cluster mode. I have written down, if we go back right here in our checklist, clustering installation checklist, if you notice right here, SQL Server instance static IP, any instance that you will install on cluster in cluster mode needs to have a static IP. So right now we're just installing one SQL Server instance on this cluster. So I have 192.168.1 and 64 static IP. If we decide to install multiple instances on the same node, then we would same node or a separate node, basically we would need another static IP. So basically the thumb rule is that one static IP per SQL Server instance. So let's go ahead and install our SQL Server in cluster mode. In order to install SQL Server in cluster mode, you would require SQL Server media. So we're gonna go ahead and go in node 1 and fire up our SQL Server 2012 media, which is right here. I'm going to go ahead and open it and run setup in administrator as an administrator. We need to click on installation. In order to install SQL Server in cluster mode, we need to click on new SQL Server failover cluster installation. Click OK. Click Next. It is installing setup files at this moment. We have one warning in our rules right here, which is network binding order, and our binding order is basically okay. It is just warning us that you need to check your network binding. Basically, if your private network, which we saw in our cluster right here, let me show you real quick, this needs to be up in binding. Let me quickly show you what binding is. If you look at advanced settings in your network and sharing, and you will see that this private and external, if your private network is up here where external is, you need to move it up. So this is best practice and also the requirement from Microsoft that you need to move your private network up in the order. So that is what the binding order is. Accept the license. Click Next. And we're going to go ahead and select SQL Server feature installation. Click Next, and we're going to go ahead and install SQL Server Data Engine and management tools right here, SQL Server client connectivity, backward compatibility, client tools SDK, and I believe that we got everything. If you wanted to, I would recommend you, my recommendation is that if you wanted to install reporting services or integration services, install it after you install SQL Server Data Engine, because they are not cluster aware. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. Click Next. Right here is your SQL Server network name. This is the network name. Basically, it's going to be if you have used SQL Server Management Studio to connect to SQL Server. Usually, what we do is we give SQL Server machine name right here, SQL machine name / SQL Server instance name. So this is going to be right here, SQL Server network name in cluster environment. This is the name that you need to give, and this is the name you will use as a machine name in order to connect to SQL Server. This is the logical name, and let's say this is TBS. In my case, it's TBS TBS cluster, TBS SQL cluster. This is my SQL Server network name, and what I would do right now, I have named instance PRO SQL prod, PROD right here, SQL prod. So it is going to be TBS SQL cluster CLU / SQL prod when you connect using SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and use named instance, and my name instance up here is SQL PROD SQL prod. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. Let me see if this is TBS SQL cluster. I wanted to make sure that I give a SQL Server network name properly, TBS SQL Server cluster SQL prod. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. Keep in mind that in the overview we saw that the disk, we are using 3 disks. One is for data, other is for these disks are already taken. One is DTC and other is our right here, these are the reserved disks. You can't use those, so we're going to go ahead and click next, and that'll bring us our available disks. So we're going to go ahead and select all of these disks. So we're going to go ahead and click next. One is for log, one is for data, and other one is for temp DB. So we're going to go ahead and click next. Up here is where you need to give your IP address. So we're going to go ahead and click IPv4, and I'm going to give address right here. This is the SQL Server I was talking about. Each instance needs to have a static IP address. So in my case it's 192.168.1. Let me take a look real quick. That is 64. Right here. So we're gonna go ahead and click next. SQL Server agent, keep in mind that I mentioned that there are good best practices for SQL Server agent and SQL Server service accounts. You should have basically the best practices in production. You should have separate SQL Server agent account. You should have a separate SQL Server engine account, and both should be on that particular node, or both nodes in the cluster as an admin on that node. So in my case, basically what I'm going to use is cluster admin. That's the account that I know that I have used it as a cluster service account, but it's also I know that have proper permission to use it for SQL Server service account. So I'm going to use cluster admin right here. Keep in mind, if you're doing in production, please have separate agent account and separate SQL Server engine account. I'm going to go ahead and provide the password. Click next. If you wanted to change the collation according to your area, whether you're in Europe, United States, I'm in United States, so I'm okay with my current collation. Right here, this is default collation, so I'm going to keep it default. Click next. And this is where you would select the authentication modes, and I'm going to go ahead and select mixed mode. Always please select mixed mode unless you are specifically trying to just do the Windows authentication. If you just select the Windows authentication, only user that has Active Directory profile will be able to connect to SQL Server. You will not be able to create SQL Server account and not be able to use SA account in order to connect to SQL Server. So keep in mind that this is very important. Click on mixed mode. So up here I'm gonna go ahead and provide SA password. Make sure that you provide the password that you remember for SA. Click on add current user, and if you wanted to add more users, right here in production, usually agent, you should add agent, SQL Server agent account, SQL Server account that you're using for SQL Server engine service account, you need to add that as well. So let's go ahead and look at the data directory. Keep in mind that we have separate data root right here. This is RF. It has taken the user database directory right here, and log directory, we're gonna go ahead and change it to our available right here. This is our let me go ahead and basically copy this. And temp DB, we have a separate temp DB drive, so we're gonna go ahead and use that T. I'm going to keep it right here. And I don't have a backup directory. If you do have a backup directory separate drive, you can go ahead and provide the backup separate directory right here. So I wanted to make sure that the drives that we selected, data drive and log drive and temp DB drive separate, this is how you would configure. Let's go ahead and click next. Click next, next, and this is the summary what is going to install. Click on install. The installation is going to take some time, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. Once the installation is completed, I'll be back. Alright, as you can see that our installation on our active node, keep in mind that in this demo we're doing active passive. The active node installation is completed. Now we're going to go ahead and go on our passive node, which is also known as failover node, and we're going to go ahead and configure failover for this particular instance we just installed on our active node. So let's go ahead and close this. I'm going to go ahead and close this as well. Alright, let's go on our TBS node 2, that is our passive node. Here is the media. We're going to go ahead and select a different option for passive node because we're going to go ahead and add failover node to this installation that we just completed for SQL Server. We're going to go ahead and run as administrator. We're going to go ahead and click on installation, and this time keep in mind that when we were installing on our active node we clicked on new SQL Server failover cluster installation. This time we're just adding a failover node to our existing SQL Server installation that we just completed on node 1. So since we're adding a node, we need to click on add node to SQL Server failover cluster. Click on this. It's installing set of files at this moment. Alright, we got the same warning that we got on our active node, which is okay. We know that the binding is right. Let's go ahead and click next. This is our SQL prod that it automatically detected since we're adding just a failover cluster node. So we installed active SQL Server prod on our active node, and this is node 2 that we're going to configure it as failover node. So everything looks okay. So we're going to go ahead and click next. As you can see right here that instance name is SQL prod, cluster network name is TBS cluster, and it gave us also the SQL Server instance name. And this is the IP address that we used, 192.168.164. Everything looks good. So let's go ahead and click next. These are the service accounts. Keep in mind that we use cluster admin on our active node, so we're going to go ahead and give the password up here. And same with SQL Server agent. Click next. Click next. Next. Alright, this is just the summary. Click install. Now adding node is in progress at this moment. This installation is going to take some time. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video again, and once the installation is completed, I'll be back. That we have finished successfully adding a failover cluster node. We can go ahead and close this. I'm going to go ahead and close all this, and let's go back to our failover. Let's go back to our node 1 and go to our failover manager again. We're gonna go ahead and make sure that SQL Server role existed there, and we're gonna go ahead and also failover our SQL Server to our passive node. Keep in mind that this demo is about active and passive installation of SQL Server, and it's loading the information about our cluster. In my case is TBS cluster, TBS 2012 cluster. Once it's loaded, we're gonna go ahead and take a look on the roles. Click on role, and as you can see that now we have two roles. One in the demo, in the beginning of the demo, we saw that in the overview of this cluster is DTC role, and other is now we just installed SQL Server and named instance SQL prod right here. Right now they both are on node 1. Let's go ahead and failover this node. Let's go ahead and failover our SQL Server instance right here to our failover node and make sure everything works fine. And I'm going to go ahead and click on resources so that you can watch the progress of failover. Let's go ahead, right click and go to move, select node, and currently we are on node 1, so we're going to go ahead and select node 2 and click OK, and you will see that first it'll fail over all the disks, and it will bring up the disk over to our failover node, and then it's going to bring up SQL Server Engine Services, and after the engine services are up, it's going to go ahead and bring SQL Server Agent Services on node 2. As you can see right here, the owner node has changed. Once everything is online, we're going to go ahead and try to connect to SQL Server. Our SQL Server network name right here is TBS SQL Cluster, so we'll be using SQL Server Management Studio in order to connect with TBS SQL Server, TBS SQL Cluster / SQL prod. Everything is online. As you can see that owner node is on node 1 now. So let's go ahead and go to our SQL Server Management Studio. Keep in mind that when you open SQL Server Management Studio for the first time, it takes time to pop up. SQL prod, let's go ahead and try to connect and see if we get connected. As you can see, we're connected with SQL Server network name TBS SQL Cluster / SQL prod. We went ahead and learned installation of SQL Server 2012 in cluster mode, and we also talked about service account permissions and requirements. We went ahead and took overview of shared disk, and basically this is it, and I hope this demo